from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's coming up. K-State's Dan O'Brien will talk about the mounting difficulties in the ethanol industry, how badly those are weighing on the corn market, and he'll comment on the USDA's planting intentions numbers released this week during Dan's weekly segment on the grain market trends. Then K-State's Erick DeWolf will advise you wheat growers to start thinking about disease management in your stands. He'll offer his early take on the potential disease threats to the Kansas crop and the factors that you need to consider when planning your fungicide strategies. Further ahead on Kansas agricultural weather, we'll welcome back in K-State's Mary Knapp. All that and more ahead on this Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
This is Agriculture Today. Thanks for tuning in once more as we talk up the grain markets now, and specifically draw from comments that were made last evening at one of those online gatherings that K-State Agricultural Economics has been hosting on the economics of agriculture during the COVID-19 pandemic, contributing last night, in large part, Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. Dan, it's very obvious that the corn trade is firmly affixed on the plummeting ethanol market and demand, and that is resonating heavily in the corn trade right now.
Well, in the corn trade overall and in the minds of corn producers, there's the likelihood of plant closures, and some have already happened from, again, the damaged U.S. economy that hurts fuel demand, but not only the U.S. economy as at stake, the oil price war between the Saudi Arabians and Russia helped to lower the oil market, the gas, and subsequently gasoline prices, all that much more, and led ethanol prices to fall off. Surprisingly, ethanol hasn't fallen off quite as much as RBOB gasoline has. So perhaps the RFS is having some effect there. But overall, if we lose 200 to 500 million bushels of corn usage from ethanol industry slowdowns or more, that'll be a big factor, I guess, in the supply-demand balance sheet. Now, there's some offset in terms of the distillers' grains market. You've seen the distillers' prices jump. And it seems like what that could be attributed to is that industries that are using DDGs, particularly in the dairy sector and the like, have been zealous to obtain whatever supplies they can get hold of. So you've seen distillers' grains prices actually move to the higher side, but that's not enough to offset the weakening of the ethanol side.
Almost overlooked, again, in the corn sector, the number that came out from the USDA on planting intentions this past Tuesday, which was beyond the top end of pre-report expectations. That would normally turn heads, but maybe the ethanol quandary has overshadowed that.
Well, it certainly has. The USDA projected 97 million acres of corn to be planted based on surveys of farmers around the United States. Post-report market expectations were that, gosh, a lot has happened since the first 2 weeks of March, that particularly to the ethanol industry, that may have changed the expectations of farmers in terms of profitability of that crop. So general acknowledged consensus is that we're probably looking at 93 to 95 million acres planted. However, a day or so ago, Lance Honig from NAS came about and said, that number, we expect it to hold up. And why? Well, people have bought their seed, et cetera. And typically, the prospective plantings number has been at least a good guide for where things are going. What this really does now, though, it aims us towards the end of June with the acreage report that'll come out, and also the next stocks report. And I think that those harder numbers, I think, have the potential to be real market movers as we get off into that late June, early July time period.
While we're talking feed grains and acreage, might bring in here as well on the sorghum side, it would appear that sorghum acreage could be up not a small amount here if the USDA numbers hold.
5.825 million acres projected to be planted, up from about 5.26 last year and about 5.7 the year before. Whereas sorghum use in ethanol plants is damaged just as much as corn has been. Here within the last couple of weeks, we'd seen pre-purchases of grain sorghum jump about 20 million bushels. And here in the last week, had seen actual shipments jump about 10. So you are seeing evidence of that in the basis levels in some key locations in Kansas. Salina, Garden City, 1 week jump of several cents in grain sorghum bids. So really indicative of some positive news for grain sorghum. I guess the way I view grain sorghum exports is that without this particular demand, specific demand for grain sorghum for exports to China and perhaps other places too, then grain sorghum it's a good competitor with corn based on value, et cetera. But when they do get a distinguishing demand away from corn, then grain sorghum prices, it's not that they detach from corn, but they start to move more independently and generally to the higher side. So we'll see how this goes for the grain sorghum industry.
And to round out the story on acreage, the soybean planting prospects announced by the USDA, their projections, were those a bit to the downside vis-a-vis the expectations, Dan?
Well, to the degree that the trade felt that the corn number of 87 million acres planted was probably on the high side by 2 or 3 million acres. They pretty much thought that those acres would go over to soybeans. So that number came in about 83.5 million acres projected by the USDA. Adjusted post-report expectations more 84, 87. As I've heard some other well-respected analysts say, so now we've bought our seed. We're waiting to get into the field. What will weather conditions allow us to do? And that'll have a lot to say with where those acres play out. So that we're on the higher side for corn right now sure isn't a surprise, given the type of experiences we had last year. And we either by desire or by being forced to, you could see some of those corn acres have to shift over to soybeans if we have any planting problems. And we have some places that were just saturated last year. So we'll see how that works out for corn versus bean acres.
And on the wheat side, we're seeing quite impressive demand for domestic milling wheat in this country. And that has to do as well with accelerated consumer demand for bread on the shelves. There's been a hike in home baking activity, we're told. So this is an interesting dynamic emerging from the COVID-19 situation, Dad.
And what's odd to me is that I'd expect to see that demand surge would reveal itself in basis, but it really has been more on the future side. The basis has been pretty level, actually. So, whereas in some of these other markets, corn and for soybeans, we've seen basis narrow up at time. Well, and grain sorghum, we've seen basis narrow up to kind of carry the day to express the wishes of local buyers. It seems in the wheat market that the futures ran up. And it's really thought-provoking, Eric, to think about how, we take corn and we feed it to livestock and there's delayed usage. Grain sorghum, we feed it to livestock, we run it through an ethanol plant, and same for corn. Again, a delay, you have to process it, takes time. Soybeans, a little closer, it becomes soybean oil, meal, and it takes some time. Bread, we send it to millers, it becomes a human consumption issue. So that we've seen the futures for wheat jump more than other commodities in regard to what's happening with the coronavirus probably isn't a surprise. It's more of a directly consumable, ag product. And frankly, one thing for us to watch, I think, is overseas in some of these countries that, again, Russia and Black Sea are both having policy discussions right now as to how much of their stockpiles they either release to domestic millers or keep back for themselves. And when I hear talk like that, I think of what happened in the rice market back in the middle, 1993, 1994, when countries started to be scared and fearful about having adequate domestic supplies. If that starts to happen, then you have a different landscape in the wheat market than we have right now.
Well, then, as you were presenting all of this last evening at this online gathering, you put a bow on it, if you will, with summary comments to producers and others who were listening in. Generally, what did you bring this down to, all told, in as far as what's going to happen moving forward with our markets, with COVID-19, the dominant influence?
First, there's acknowledgement of how we just do not know the direct and indirect impacts that are all going to come here. We can try to anticipate some of what's going on. And perhaps the biggest thing to think on at the end is if this recession, and there's acknowledgement of recession, some talk even worse now, but it's recession in the U.S. and the world has a quick recovery, and that's also being talked about. What position will the U.S. ethanol industry be in when gasoline demand picks up again? Are we just mothballing, or are we bankrupting? So that's an issue. And the value of the dollar, we're not doing just wonderfully in our economy, but the U.S., with the Fed backing up our system, right now it sounds like the U.S. is being looked to, and the Federal Reserve as a backup for a lot of the economic activity in the world. So with that, though, the value of the dollar goes higher. And that's a direct negative then for wheat exports, for any of our exports. So that'll be an issue I think we'll have to be dealing with. And really, maybe the biggest question at the end of this is what permanent changes will this coronavirus pandemic cause in the U.S. economy overall? And I think we can see that in terms of social media, et cetera. But what changes will it cause in world agricultural policies? The knee-jerk reaction would be for countries to, if anything, have more protectionism, to want to bolster their own domestic production, to not have problems again with the logistical issues that they're dealing with now. And will we see more action like what China does in terms of building up domestic stocks as a hedge against these types of things? I guess we'll see. I would not be completely negative about our price prospects, because I think there'll be unanticipated surprises and limitations on availability of grain from different places, that if the U.S. is in position to ship grain to different countries, we may be able to take advantage of that.
Well, Dan, we thank you for pulling from your presentation last night at that online gathering on the economics of agriculture during COVID-19, which focused on the grain trades. Next week, we'll talk again. Many thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
That from grain market economist Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension. He's our regular Friday guest right here on Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Agriculture Today continues now. Well, winter wheat stands around Kansas are at long last on their way. They've broken dormancy and pushing toward the jointing stage. With that, you growers now start thinking about the potential for disease issues in that wheat. Right here, we've brought by via phone Erick DeWolf, K-State plant pathologist and a longtime wheat disease expert here at the university. Right to it, Erick. Given how the crop got started and then made it through the winter, what disease troubles, if any, are you anticipating at this moment anyway?
Right. So this is the time of year where we begin to look to ourselves and the potential for risk of diseases like stripe rust or leaf rust developing in our wheat crop. Remember, these rust diseases are public enemy number 1 and number 2 on some of our long-term yield records in their ability to affect our yield of our wheat crop here in Kansas. What we're looking for at this time of year is to remember that both the fall conditions in when our wheat crop is being established here locally, but also to ourselves in Texas, and then also in February, as the crop continues to develop in Texas and our own crop breaks dormancy, we can get some early indicators of what's going on with the disease.
So what is the early report card out of the Southern Plains then?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting this year in that the main drivers, the weather patterns to be watching for would be rainfall patterns in southern Texas. And I think, as we mentioned, those key time periods, both November and then particularly as we headed through the winter months into February, it looked like conditions in southern Texas where these rust diseases often survive during the winter and then move north were very dry. So the early report card or early indicators would suggest that, at least for stripe rust, it looks like the risk is lower than it's been in a number of years.
And that is because we fully understand how costly stripe rust can be. That's very good news if that holds up then, Erick.
That is good news. I think if we continue to get some reasonable amounts of rainfall locally and the yield potential of our crop continues to improve, and we can avoid some disease problems like stripe rust, that would be a big plus for our growers here in the state.
But how about the companion rust diseases, leaf rust in particular?
Well, I think we do need to keep an eye on leaf rust. So it's not necessarily the same time periods or weather conditions that would be either favoring or suppressing leaf rust. And that would be consistent with some of the observations from wheat breeders and wheat production experts in Texas. Right now, they're reporting that they did see a little bit of stripe rust earlier, but it seems like that particular disease was slowing in southern Texas. But like you said just a moment ago, they are reporting that leaf rust is continuing to develop in that part of the country. So I think right now, at least from those early indicators, suggest that we'll need to keep an eye on leaf rust and make sure that we don't get any surprises here later in the season.
Now, here in Kansas, we have seen wet conditions for a fair part of wheat country in the state, the far west and southwest notwithstanding. That would likely set the stands up for potential issues apart from the rust complex, would it not?
Well, I think so. So the other things to be watching, I know we've talked about a lot of these rust diseases that would be moving from other regions and how the weather conditions there would be influencing or suppressing the development. But like you're pointing out, there's other disease threats that may be surviving locally that we need to keep an eye on, particularly when we have frequent enough rainfall to increase our yield potential dramatically. Those same weather conditions that favor yield potential would favor diseases like tan spot or the septoria complex of leaf spotting diseases that survive locally in some of our crop residues. When we have frequent rainfall, that can favor the initial establishment of those diseases right around the jointing stages of growth where we're at in the southern portion of the state right now.
So one, as we are at that jointing stage, would want to be scouting their fields for tan spot, for septoria. They need to stay on top of that, it sounds, Erick, because those come on fairly fast.
I think so. I think this is the time of year where it's a great time to be out scouting, looking for these disease problems. Any indication that we're getting leaf spots or certainly if we're getting signs of rust getting established at this point in what would soon become the mid-canopy, that's an indicator that there is a significant local risk of disease problems. So that information coupled with the price of wheat and any cost of fungicide application, the yield potential of our crop, are all pieces of information that we would use to make that final fungicide decision.
We'll spend a little more time on that point in a second. What about our old nemesis, wheat streak mosaic? Last year, well, a rather moderate year for wheat streak compared to a couple of years previous. What's the thinking going into the productive side of this year's crop?
Well, so I think the verdict is still out on wheat streak mosaic. As we enter these jointing stages of growth, it's about the time that we would start to see symptoms showing up in our wheat for wheat streak mosaic, where we'd be looking for portions of the field to be looking yellow and just not responding to fertility treatments that we may have put in place. Probably the key driver of wheat streak outbreaks, as you may remember back to 2017, is moisture conditions in the fall that favor early and lush growth of our wheat crop, but also very mild temperatures. Warm temperatures in the fall and into the winter months also favor survival of those wheat curl mites that spread these particular viruses around. And when those conditions are present in the fall, we can have a lot more movement of the virus and a lot more widespread problems of our wheat streak mosaic virus. So right now, if I understand right, a lot of the Winter wheat crop was planted a little bit late and emerged a little late just because of the flow of when our other field crops were coming out and what weather conditions were allowing for our other field operations, planting operations at that time. So right now I'm not anticipating major problems with wheat streak mosaic because of those factors, but let's keep an eye out for that too while we're checking for these foliar diseases and make sure that we are in fact seeing just only low levels or below normal levels of that disease also.
Well, you brought this up a second ago as far as management of whatever diseases may turn up in winter wheat stands out there. What producers need to think about in the planning process, trying to evaluate that need for fungicide treatment and the investment that goes with it as much in advance as possible. What things should they be mulling over right now, do you think, Eric?
Well, I think there's a couple pieces of information that are really important. So we've talked a lot in this particular radio spot about kind of the overall risk of disease and some of these early indicators of what's going on with rust disease within our region that occur in February and March are really important first pieces of information. We might couple that with information that comes from our own local scouting. Do we take the time to look and see what's going on with our crop, and that will help us keep an eye on leaf spotting diseases or other things that might be surviving locally. So that kind of overall disease risk component is important. But the other factors are things that are maybe a little bit more out of our control. So they're going to be things related to the wheat market and our yield potential. Is the value of that grain going to justify additional inputs for fungicides? Is the yield potential going to justify these additional inputs as well? We want to make good decisions here as good managers of the crop. Probably the final piece, and maybe where growers could do a little bit of research to help themselves out, is to be investigating what fungicide product options that they have available to them and what the costs of some of those inputs might be this year. So making some contact with local applicators, local chemical suppliers, if you have your own application equipment, can be a prudent thing just to make sure you understand what all the parts of that equation may be related to prices and input costs. So a little bit of homework now can save you a lot of time and stress later when we do reach those critical growth stages.
Very well. And we'd leave folks with this, Eric, that the Plant Disease Diagnostic Laboratory here at K-State is still receiving samples from producers for analysis, so folks can still get in touch with their local extension personnel and find out what the current protocol is for submitting those samples and then go from there.
Absolutely. So it seems like a lot of things are questionable right now with everything going on with the human viruses that are out there. But it's just important to let people know that plant disease clinic is, in fact, open here on K-State's campus and able to receive samples. This is particularly important for some of the viral diseases that are hard to diagnose without that type of laboratory testing. So if they do find themselves in a situation where they need that kind of virus testing, they can get samples into the disease diagnostic lab here at K-State, and we should be able to turn that around for them and help get the answers that the people need.
And noting there are specific and special protocols given the COVID-19 situation in as far as submitting samples, do contact via phone, via email, your local extension personnel. They can walk you through that process. Well, Eric, we appreciate the early thoughts as we are seeing the winter wheat crop starting to really get going now on potential disease troubles that might afflict it. And we'll talk again soon. Many thanks for your time.
You're welcome.
Erick DeWolf, plant pathologist at Kansas State University. And Agriculture Today will return in a few moments here on the K-State Radio Network.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
You're listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network, now in our 96th year of broadcast service to agriculture in Kansas and the Central Plains. Eric Atkinson here. Now today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Farm groups and House lawmakers are saying that the Small Business Administration is not following congressional intent when it has excluded farmers from the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program that was modified by Congress in the Coronavirus Aid Relief Economic Security Act. The EIDL program, for short, allows low-interest loans of up to $2 million to small businesses. But the SBA specifically states on its website that the program is for non-farm private sector disaster loans. Under the CARES Act, the program was expanded, and it does reference small agricultural cooperatives. The program also sets up funds for individual grants to small businesses of up to $10,000. On Wednesday, a coalition of farm groups, including the American Farm Bureau Federation and the National Farmers Union, wrote Small Business Administrator Jovita Carranza, saying that the SBA had posted a new EIDL website that does state that applicants must certify that they're not an agricultural enterprise, other than an aquaculture enterprise, agricultural cooperative, or a nursery. Now, a DTN correspondent tested that site and found that the loan application process contains that exact language that the coalition cited. The website does not allow anyone to continue if they state that they are an agricultural enterprise. The coalition added they believe that the clear statutory language of the CARES Act indicates that agricultural businesses can participate in the emergency EIDL program, as was the intent of Congress, as their letter read. On Thursday, a coalition of 86 House members, led by Representative Antonio Delgado of New York, also wrote Carranza that they were shocked and disappointed, contrary to congressional intent, that the Small Business Administration singles out farmers and agricultural businesses as ineligible for the program. During a press briefing this week, President Trump suggested that U.S. farms would not survive without a continuous flow of H-2A foreign visa workers who are brought to the country by producers. Acting Department of Homeland Security Secretary Chad Wolf says his agency is considering a number of different options with the H-2A workers at the direction of the President and Vice President Mike Pence. They're looking at a variety of different options that they think will be very beneficial, according to Wolf. The State Department recently announced they're waiving the in-person interview requirements for H-2A applicants that do not present a risk. The USDA's report on farmers' planting intentions can be right on target with actual plantings or can differ significantly from what actually is planted. A USDA statistician stresses that point in this report from Gary Crawford.
Were you surprised at the high corn acreage numbers and lower than expected soybean acreage in this week's USDA prospective plantings report? Well, don't be surprised, though, if farmers change their minds about their intentions or have them changed for them.
When you're still, in many cases, a good month away from even getting into the field, there's a lot of factors that can change between now and when those crops get into the ground.
Lance Honig with USDA Statistics Service says weather can cause a change in plans as it did last year.
And obviously what the market does is going to have a big impact on those decisions.
And that corn market has certainly changed since farmers were surveyed weeks ago for that prospective plantings report.
And in fact, this very report can be one of the tools that producers use to change from what their intentions are to what they actually plant.
For corn over the last 20 years, the planting intentions number has been below the actual planting 10 times, above it 10 times, and the difference between the forecast and the actual planted acreage has ranged from very small, just 32,000 acres, to very large at 3 million. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
Well, one of the silver linings of the COVID-19 situation is that more and more people have discovered or rediscovered the rewards of home baking. Flour consumption has really taken off over the last several weeks as consumers try their hand at baking. Marcia Boswell takes a closer look at that on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
In times of uncertainty, we seek a sense of control. While we are working from home, it's not quite as convenient to run through the drive-thru on the way home. We've been asked to visit grocery stores only once a week. We have time at home with our families, time that we don't usually get at home. What do these things have in common? People are cooking and baking at home like we haven't seen in decades. Kitchen staples such as bread, tortillas, and flour have been scooped off the shelves, while flour millers and bakers scramble to ramp up production in the midst of the increase in demand. According to Tim O'Connor, president of the Wheat Foods Council, If you think about the things you make with flour, you think about holiday meals, special occasions, family recipes, and food you want to eat in a time of uncertainty. The activity of baking together is also a fun way to bring the family together. This increased desire to bake at home has been evidenced by the surge in visits to eatwheat.org, a website that was created by Kansas wheat farmers to share the story of how wheat is grown. In the last month, traffic has risen dramatically. The eatwheat.org website and campaign was launched in November of 2017. After 2.5 years of operation, eatwheat.org has had 500,000 visitors to the website, averaging about 17,000 visitors per month. In the past 30 days, more than 24,000 visitors have come to the website. These viewers typically come to the site to grab some quick and easy recipes, but they stay to learn more about where their food comes from. Some of the most popular pages on the site include quick and easy dinner recipes, such as layered taco casserole, Italian crescent casserole, and Parmesan garlic spaghetti. Another very popular post during this time of keeping school kids at home is salt dough handprint ornaments, which was originally developed as a holiday activity, but users have been adapting it to make with their families this spring. Eat Wheat's standout traffic performer is Pinterest. The popular Pinterest account has garnered around 3 million views per month on the wheat-based ideas shared on our feed. This totals 36 million pairs of eyes on wheat recipes in the last year alone. While not every pin shared on the account comes from eatwheat.org, every pin is wheat-related. The most popular boards on this social search engine include 30-minute meals, weeknight meals, I love bread, comfort food, and 5-ingredient meals. Users come from cities such as Dallas-Fort Worth, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and Atlanta. If you are interested in learning more about the Eat Wheat project, please visit eatwheat.org and amplify these messages by sharing social media posts at Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Pinterest. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Many thanks, Marcia. In a moment, we'll get into the latest on Kansas agricultural weather with K-State's Mary Knapp on Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Now for you on Agriculture Today, our weekly time set aside to take a look at Kansas agricultural weather. And joining us via video conference today is climatologist Mary Knapp of K-State Research and Extension. Well, Mary, in a moment we'll talk about the sudden shift in our weather the last 24 hours, but we do have some unfinished business in the recap of the month of March.
Right. The big winner or loser, depending upon your point of view, in the rain sweepstakes was the Southeast Division. They averaged just a shade over 5 inches for the month. That puts them at 160+% of normal. It ends up being the third wettest start to the year on record. When you put that on top of the wet years that they had in 2018, 2019, they're pretty much ready to shift some of that moisture to someone else. And that someone else that could really use it would be up in the Northwest, North Central Division. Northwest actually did fairly well with the wet week that they had to end the month, but they came in at an average of 1.27 inches, which is about 95% of normal for their March. The big loser was, as I said, the North Central. They averaged just 0.9 of an inch, which is about 42% of what they would typically see for the month of March. And they certainly don't want that to extend any longer. They could use some moisture to kind of even things out and get that winter wheat up and going, get the field conditions right for the spring season.
And everybody in between then more or less on a normal keel for moisture?
No, we still have that variable pattern. The northeast and the east central were fairly close to normal in the 90%, 98% level. You get into the southwest, they just had half of their normal, and the central division was at 44% of the normal. Overall, the state was 81% of normal, but again, it was heavily tilted towards the southeast.
And the temperatures for the month of March, where did they rate compared to the norm?
They were on the warm side for the month, and it was warmer than normal statewide. The West Central came closest to normal. They averaged 43 degrees, and that was about a degree warmer than normal. The Southwest and the Southeast vied to be the warmest divisions. The Southwest averaged 48.2 degrees, which was just about 4 degrees warmer than normal. The Southeast averaged 50 degrees, and they had an identical 3.8, almost 4 degrees warmer than normal.
That's the story on the month of March. Now, to get April rolling here, a late freeze, as is typical for Kansas, has in fact rolled in, and that has raised some questions about the impact on the winter wheat crop.
Right. Romulo Lovato is working on an e-update article, which should come out today, that will do an analysis on that. But just a quick look at that, we are seeing temperatures in the teens across most of western Kansas. Some places the lows were, at the 20, 21 degree mark. But again, we also were looking at how many hours the temperature has been below 24. And again, the western half of the state really had quite a few hours doing that. Not so much of an issue in the Northwest, where the wheat is not as far advanced, but we still had up in Cheyenne County 20 hours below 24 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the Southwest, where the wheat is further along in its development, we still had 4 to 6 hours below that 24 degree threshold. And producers can follow that by going to the mesonet.ksu.edu and check under the weather tab, and there's a freeze monitor tool that will let you dial in on your particular area and see how you fared.
Take a look at that at mesonet.ksu.edu, the freeze monitor. So we have that, and we had some moisture come in with this change in the conditions, but not heavy levels of moisture. It doesn't appear so far anyway, Mary.
No, and it'll take a little bit to get all of those numbers in, because unfortunately, in many cases, it came in a freezing rain, freezing drizzle format, and it takes a little while for people to melt that down and get it in for the report. The preliminary here on campus, we had 0.02 of an inch of precip, so not a super amount. If we look at the COCORAS reports that have been filed so far today, the heaviest was northeast of Clay Center with 0.4 of an inch of that liquid equivalent. We've got quite a few reports in the 1/10 of an inch or better, Chapman, Barnes, Greenleaf, Leavenworth. But when you get out into the western area, Ashland down in Clark County reported nothing, as did Holcomb, Dodge City, Ulysses, and again, other stations out there in the western reaches.
Well, then, what's ahead for this coming week, Mary? Starting with the weekend, this system will move out. We'll see a gradual warm-up, it appears.
Right. We should see some warmer temperatures, not much in the way of precipitation for the 7-day time period. But when we look out into the little bit further future, the 6 to 10 and the 8 to 14 day forecasts, which cover through the middle of April, favor wetter than normal conditions. And we're going to see a warm up that continues for the 6 to 10 day period. But when you move into that 8 to 14 day, there's a strong signal for colder than normal to cover that period. The question will be just how cold is that colder than normal? It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to see the kind of low temperatures that we saw with this wave.
As you say, Mary, we're on the typical spring weather roller coaster here in Kansas, and we appreciate the update. Take care. We'll catch up with you again next week.
Thanks, Eric. We'll talk to you later.
This week's input on Kansas agricultural weather from K-State climatologist Mary Knapp. Likewise, thanks to you for being along with us right here. Enjoy your weekend. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.